So these are a series of short videos on a highlight of the problem with leadership, which is the introduction to the book, A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman. This video is just about the first of those 4 points that he says he's found everywhere in all kinds of institutions, from families to churches to corporations, that he believes are the heart of a problem in North America or in America in terms of our understanding of leadership. And this needs to be understood and addressed. So this first one is, there's a regressive trend in which the most dependent members of any organization set the agendas, and where adaptation is constantly towards weakness rather than strength, thus leveraging power to the recalcitrant, the problematic, or the passive-aggressive, and the most anxious members of an institution rather than towards the energetic, the visionary, the imaginative, and the motivated. I'm going to tell some of these stories in a general way because it's not really about the specific situations, but I have seen this again and again. Particularly I see this because I tend to come into churches, I tend to contract with churches that are already in an anxious state. For instance, if there's been a hard parting with their previous pastor, they're doing a lot of what we would call sniffing of their own armpits, and they're very, very touchy about anything that sounds like a blame statement as to why the problem developed. They generally tend to want the problem to have been the pastor that just left, and will often work hard to persuade the next person of that. And that's a part of the anxiety that goes on. And so, but where I've seen this more specifically is in an example of a church that I knew of. So I was not directly involved with them, but I was working a little bit with their pastor at the time, who was experiencing a puzzling pattern that he couldn't understand. And that pattern was something like this, again generalizing. A topic would be discussed by the leadership team. A vote would be taken, and the matter would be approved. And the next meeting, 2 or 3 members would come back and want to undo that decision. And this happened repeatedly. It was very frustrating for him. He didn't understand what was going on. After some conversation and some questions, the main breakthrough question being, are these 3 people that seem to do this all the time, are they related in any way? Do they all work at the same place? Do they have a connection like that? And it turns out they were all from one larger family. Some were in-laws and that kind of thing. And the patriarch of this family had quit attending that particular congregation, but the family still went there for dinner or for lunch, however you call it, what part of the world you live in, on Sundays. And there, the latest decision would be talked about. The patriarch, this is what we found out over time, the patriarch would tear the decision apart. They would feel uncomfortable and they would come back and want to change it. Even though this patriarch no longer attended, he was having massive influence. Another example that I've seen of this regressive trend in which the most dependent members, the weaker members you could say, the most unstable members or emotionally immature, are the ones that are setting the agenda. There are many stories actually here. Some of them are on some of my blogs. This video is sort of like converting some of my blog information into public videos. But there's a story that I have called I Can't Even Die in My Own Church, which is an illustration of this particular thing. But what begins to happen, a pattern that can be established in churches where especially the elders, if they are doing visiting, have been trained to set up a time of complaint as part of the visit. Then what happens is So I've been told by some elders that this is what they were taught to do. They always end the visit with, so are there any other concerns? Now, some of them were taught this with the deliberate understanding that they were not going to take it seriously, but just give people a chance to vent. But I still think it's rather unhealthy in terms of some of this material. So what starts to happen if the congregation hits a certain anxiety level is that the people that don't do well with dealing with their own anxiety, they want somebody to fix it. And so what often happens, and I had this in one church, where there was an elder who was not very articulate in his speaking and his communications, but he was similarly minded to many of the people that were anxious, and they tended to also then be, and I want to say this carefully, traditionalistic or ritualistic, which we often call conservative, but there are differences between those. And anyway, they would seek this particular elder out, and they would lodge their complaints about what they thought needed to be fixed, and this would repeatedly be brought to the various leadership meetings, and to the point where this particular elder was very, very, very anxious and troubled by this burden that he had accepted in terms of accepting people coming to him, because they believed that he would champion their concerns. And it's hard as a pastor or as any leader when concerns like that are brought to the leadership level to not feel somehow responsible to fix it for the people. But once you learn that it might be their emotional immaturity that is creating the complaint, changes everything. And this is what he gets at in this one. A regressive trend in which the most dependent members of any organization are the ones setting the agendas, and where any adaptation, any change, is constantly towards the weakness rather than strength. So that leverages the power to those who are resisting. I also have a blog post where I call this the tyranny of the minority. And because councils believe they need to be compassionate and those kinds of things, they will not lead in the face of those kinds of complaints. I think I'll leave that at that. That's the first of the 4. Now I'll go to make a video on the second one.